King Henry comes on stage. His kinsman Ralph Neville, the first Earl of Westmoreland, probably not seeing the king, says, "Oh, that we now had here but 1/10,000 of those men in England that do no work today." At Agincourt, the English found themselves hopelessly outnumbered by the French. The English had been marching for 250 miles in mud. They were sick, malnourished, all 6,000 of them very tired. The French, however, were fresh. All 12,000 to 30,000 of them. It depends upon which historical account one reads. The English were outnumbered 2-1 at least, and maybe 5-1. And so Westmoreland understandably longs for reinforcements. In Shakespeare's play, the king overhears Westmoreland's comment and then gives his famous St. Crispin's Day speech, which many of our students over the years have had to memorize. I will not read you the entirety of it, don't worry, because I don't have it memorized. The king overhears him, and the next line is, "What's he that wishes so?" says King Henry. "My cousin Westmoreland? No, my fair cousin, if we are marked to die, we are enough to do our country loss. And if to live, the fewer men, the greater share of honor." You will remember that the king talks about the soldiers with him at Agincourt on that day of battle. He says that every year on St. Crispin's Day, such men will strip his sleeve and show his scars and say, "These wounds I had on St. Crispin's Day." Toward the end of his speech, he says, "This story shall the good man teach his son, and Crispian shall ne'er go by from this day to the ending of the world. But we in it shall be remembered, we few, we happy few, we band of brothers. For he today that sheds his blood with me shall be my father, my brother, be he ne'er so vile. This day shall gentle his condition." Greetings, graduate, students, faculty, and staff, honored guests, friends, and family. This day has been a long time coming. I'm sure Emma feels that. Actually, I know Emma pretty well. I'm telling you, she felt that for the last 6 months or so. Graduation fever. But it's even longer than her years studying here at St. Andrew's College. For the last 15 years, I've had people asking about college credit for high school classes. And Father Kent Bartell, longtime friend of the school, former assistant headmaster at St. Andrew's and current board member, just outright at that time said, "We need to start a college." This St. Crispin's Day speech that I just gave you a glimpse of is an apt speech for today's classical Christian educators in general, and particularly the Anglican School Association schools who are almost all parochial and are classical, not because it's hip and faddish, though it is, but because Anglican education has a long, long history of this classical education. This speech by King Henry in Shakespeare's play is particularly apt for St. Andrew's College, the first Anglican college planted in America in almost 150 years. As a micro-college, a new phenomenon in American post-secondary education, St. Andrews starts small, as did all the micro-colleges out there. Probably most micro-colleges over the last 20 or so years started with between 2 and 4 students. It takes some patience. The academic world in America is shifting fast. Changes are underway and will become even more dramatic. Universities and colleges that have been around since the 1800s are closing right and left. Students and families are tired of overpaying for an education that doesn't fulfill what was promised. Moreover, the colleges of our culture are overwhelmingly detrimental to the Christian faith of today's students, our students. It's time for an ad fontes movement in education in America, a return to the sources. A classical education is rooted in this very idea. As a church, we must make this move to bring back the education that was birthed in the church. It's not just a dreamy idea. It is paramount to the mission of the church. We're losing our children and have been for decades now. They become enculturated into the world, and find that they have no use for Jesus or his church. This is often true even if they continue to participate at some level in the church. Rather, we need our young people to grow into soldiers of Christ's church, which in our world means being rather countercultural. If we aim to help our students be countercultural adults, to engage, live, and thrive for the kingdom in the culture of advanced modernity, we have to ask the question, into exactly what positive world are we then enculturating them, bringing them? A Christianized advanced modernity with a patina of Plato will not do. C.S. Lewis, for one, was medieval to the core. He's more our model. It takes more than studying Latin and Greek and more than reading the great books. It takes forming a classical Christian pre-modern mind. Lewis notes in his inaugural address at Cambridge as the chair of medieval and Renaissance English that the greatest divide in history, get this is important, the greatest divide in history is not between the so-called Dark Ages and the Renaissance. Many people assume that. If we do not, he asks, put the great divide between the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, where should we put it? In the rest of the address, Lewis makes a strong argument that the dividing line is what he came, quote, to regard as the greatest of all divisions in the history of the West. And that is that which divides the present from, say, the age of Jane Austen. The great divide is between the pre-modern and modernity. That modernity is the biggest change and challenge in the history of Western. He argues that modernity is the biggest change and challenge in the history of Western civilization. And now modernity itself has run its course, so that we are living at one of those rare hinges of history, from the collapse of modernity to who knows what is next. We've been living in a postmodern world of nihilism and meaninglessness, a world where, to quote Nietzsche, we've wiped away the entire horizon. Whatever the near future holds, and it is impossible to predict, the church must prepare and equip the next generation to face this unknown with a greater resilience and discernment than has been typical of our efforts. Now is the opportune moment to return to the long-abandoned pre-modern mind in the form of the medieval synthesis of classical and Christian. To be equipped for a postmodern world, we must return to that pre-modern mindset. That sounds very strange to the average American. But let me assure you, ours is the dark age. The age of disenchantment, the death work culture. As philosopher Peter Kreeft writes, we are now living in the real dark ages, which history books of the future will describe as the century of genocide. Flannery O'Connor warned that we must push back against culture as hard as it is pushing against us. In most of our Christian schools, we really are not. We must do better. Too often we classical educators have merely replaced the industrial stamp used for educating young citizens and workers for the last 150 years. Right? They just go through the assembly line, they get stamped. Now we've just changed the stamp to a stamp that says trivium on it, or classical. We're still in many ways stuck in the factory production mode, just stamping out classically educated citizens instead of good factory worker citizens. This is not sufficient for the challenges that our young people are going to face in their coming world. Hans Boersma argues that the contemporary culture tends to define the world by what is observable, that is, empiricism. Often, he says, we do not go beyond the world of the senses, but the pre-modern world saw this worldly material things, the stuff we touch, the objects that we perceive empirically, as related or linked to greater otherworldly spiritual realities. Everything that we observe for a pre-modern mind was connected sacramentally to the eternal Logos or Word of God, in which they all cohere. If this is the correct perspective, which I think it is, says Boersma, then everything we observe with the senses is like a small s sacrament in which the Logos makes himself present in some way. The medieval mind assumed that there was a spiritual connection between the natural world and human events. Matter was never just matter, a dead object, but a living thing infused with a real spiritual presence and purpose. Boersma argues that a medieval frame of mind was sacramental. Historian Chris Armstrong echoes this sentiment in his reflections on Lewis' love of the ordinary. Quote, Lewis's love of concrete and common things, trees, mountains, weather, was not just aesthetic, but sacramental. He wrote, every created thing is, in its degree, an image of God, and the ordinate and faithful appreciation of that thing, a clue which truly followed, will lead back to him. Close quote. The central theological lens of the medieval mind is the lens of sacramentalism. We must recover this lens and use it in our educational institutions. Students should be exposed to primary sources in both literature, philosophy, and history. Lewis encouraged such reading directly, rather than relying on modern interpretations, which we see so often. He believed that direct engagement with texts like Dante's The Divine Comedy, Chaucer's The Canterbury Tales, and Boethius's The Consolation of Philosophy could help one understand how medieval people thought about the world. And those medievals, to be sure, had read the great classic works of antiquity, such as Thucydides' History of the Peloponnesian War, and they had synthesized them into their medieval worldview. In doing this kind of education, students will, by God's grace, adopt the epistemological humility of the medieval mind, which focused on understanding the world as it is, rather than attempting to reshape it according to human desire. This humility is not the spirit of our age. Lewis would have agreed that education without a true spiritual formation and virtue, as practically useful as it might be, runs the risk of creating a more clever devil. To gain the knowledge and skills of a sophisticated education without the humility to use it in service of God and others provides an intoxicating temptation to many people to use it to their own advantage. Our young people desire a view of reality that is exciting, enchanted, and meaningful, and real. With an ad fontes education, all of life becomes a grand adventure in experiencing God's real presence. Cognition will give way to experience, disenchantment to enchantment, darkness to light, death to life, prose to poetry, poetry to music, reason to wonder, and wonder to worship. Such an old way of living is worth embracing. And that's what we have done here at St. Andrews, not perfectly, but we've embraced it, and we've worked at it, embracing it more every day. And embrace it you have, Emma. And so have our other students, few as you are. But someone has to lead the way, my friends. The path is steep, with obstacles in the way. A path called Weary All in ancient British folklore. How's that path up that hill? But God will have the victory, and we will remember. We few, we happy few, we band of brothers. Thank you.